Okay, so welcome to this second of our summer sessions. We have another one on Wednesday for those of you that are really keen, that we are doing the basics of coding qualitative data with you then. But today is all about the interview. Just briefly, for those of you who haven't met us before, I'm Katrina.
And I'm Helen.
That's a prompt for you.
Sorry.
And together we founded Breaking Binaries Research 2.5 years ago now, and we do research about marginalised identities at work, but also because of our interest in qualitative research, we started doing a number of sessions on methods training. Last year we did the Twilight series, and those are also available, recordings are available on our blog, and this year we're doing the summer sessions, which I've mentioned just now, that this is the second of third, and no doubt we will be doing more because we've already got plans to do one on reflexivity at some stage. Maybe we'll have an autumn something session beginning with A. We shall see. So today we are going to go through some basics around interviewing, why we interview, what an interview is all about. Then we'll go through interviewing skills, and we will, either there or in part 3, because I can't quite remember how the slides fall, we'll be doing some practice, we'll be demonstrating how to set up an interview. And then in part 3, we'll be demonstrating some different challenges that you might face being an interviewer. I get to be different people being interviewed, and Helen gets to interview me. And then we're going to give you an opportunity in breakout rooms to do some interviewing yourselves, just very briefly, to get an opportunity to interview, be interviewed, and then to observe, and then we'll bring everybody back together and do some debriefing on that. So it'd be great if you could let us know what your experiences have been of doing research interviews so far. Please do stick those into the chat, because everybody's got both the interview that went like a dream and they couldn't believe the magical things that the person they were speaking to was saying, the things that you know was setting off light bulbs and bells ringing as you were hearing it, and thinking how great all these quotes were going to be in your dissertation or your thesis or your paper. And we've all of us, no matter how long we've been interviewing for, also often have had some that haven't gone quite so well, didn't quite go to plan. And of course now we're often managing technology now, so there's other factors to that can happen. And we've all had dictaphone failures as well as Zoom problems as well.
I think one of my greatest, and one of the reasons we decided to do this session is, if you were within the quantitative world and conducting forms of data collection, there's huge amounts of training available, and there's this expectation that people can just do an interview off the bat, and actually it's quite a sophisticated skill. To be able to interview well is quite a sophisticated skill, and we don't think there is a huge amount of training on offer for qualitative researchers, and there's an expectation that anyone can just go and do an interview, which is absolutely not the case. And hopefully by the end of the session we will give you some starter tools that you can take away to use your interviews. And this is just to point out that even experienced researchers do not have always the requisite skills to be able to conduct really great interviews. Now, I just want to really emphasize it is a skill. You get better of it, you get better with practice, and it's not just about going to have a conversation with somebody. There are quite a lot you need to think about, and generally there's an assumption that qualitative research, you just go and do some interviews and that's job done. Actually, by the end of the session, we want to really instill the fact that there's a lot of preparation, a lot of thought, and a lot of thinking that you need to do in the interview to make sure you get the best quality data.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So getting going on part 1. So most qualitative research has a basic assumption that we need to somehow extract information from other people, and that the interview is often presented as the most flexible and, of course, popular way of actually acquiring that information. We talk about it as a method of data collection, but of course, information and ideas and views and opinions don't become data all by themselves. They are created as data, in this case, in a dialogic, in a dialogue, in which both the participant or interviewee, whatever term you prefer, and the interviewer are active participants. So it's really important to remember that the interviewer is as active in creating the data as the participant. And the idea is that we should be trained, as Helen has said, in order to sort of do this in the least painful way for all involved, really. It being, if you are interviewing or considering interviewing as part of your data collection, it's really worth ensuring you've also had an experience of being interviewed, because you will learn quite a lot about interviewing from being interviewed as well. You know, I was about to say, as long as the other person's good at it, but you would learn quite a lot if they weren't as well. But often we, as Helen's already said, we oversimplify this idea, just rock up and spend, 45 minutes to an hour talking to someone, but it is really more complicated than that. There are lots of different types of qualitative research interviews. We today are focusing on pure dialogic interviews, where the most common kind, where the interviewer is got a set of questions that they would like to ask and discuss with a participant. But that is only one and probably the most basic form of interview. And if you are interested in some more advanced methods, we can certainly put some reading up on our blog to help you with that. But certainly, for example, if you are interested in doing a form of phenomenological research, it's really important that you start right at the beginning and design your data collection in accordance with the basic premises of phenomenology. And similarly, if you want to think about interviewing multiple participants, we don't discuss focus groups explicitly here, but obviously you've got a much more complex set of potential power dynamics if you're interviewing more than one person, that really require a lot of consideration in advance. And by technologically mediated interviews, we don't only mean those that you're conducting via Zoom or Teams or some other form, but they could be interviews involving some form of technology, whether you are looking at a screen or you're asking someone to walk you through a process that they might do on a computer, etc. Obviously, ethics is really critical in relation to all forms of qualitative data collection, but I guess it's most often discussed in interviews with regards to informed consent. And this is really critical, and we will talk a little bit more as we go through and we discuss the setup for interviews, about how you introduce the notion of informed consent. But this is really about ensuring that the participants, the interviewees, are clear at the start of the interview about what is involved and why. And particularly if you are going to be introducing photos or any objects, that they understand how that features in the interview. They understand why they've been particularly asked to be interviewed, what it is about them or their experiences that make them an appropriate participant for the research. But while you start informed consent at the beginning of the interview, and often with a checklist that you are going through with the participant and asking them either digitally or in person to tick that they're agreeing to various aspects of the interview, it's really important to remember that it has to be maintained across the interview. It is important to remind and be alert to any potential discomfort or time pressures or experiences that you read as the interview progresses, and to remind participants that they might like to take a break or perhaps not address a particular question or turn the recording off at any particular time. It is important, obviously, to abide by those rights. And I don't think I've ever had a participant from memory subsequently withdraw from their data from a research project, but it is important that they do have that right, and that right continues, unless you put a deadline on it, in perpetuity. Anonymity and confidentiality are really fundamental basis of much qualitative research, and how you handle that and the degree to which you go to using pseudonyms or for individuals and organisations, etc., may well depend on the type of research that you're undertaking and the context within which you are undertaking that. It may be enough to have a pseudonym or a participant number, and to just change, take out other names and put the word name in. It might not matter. They might not need another pseudonym. If you're doing research in an organisation, it becomes a lot more tricky when people are talking about other people that you're interviewing in an organisational context or project. And so that requires quite a lot of careful planning at the start. There is a lot of discussion about the numbers of participants. I'm smiling slightly because Helen and I talk about this a lot. This really does depend on your overall sort of ontological and epistemological framing and your broader methodological framework. So, for example, if you are working in a phenomenological framework, doing something like interpretive phenomenological analysis, which Helen did for her PhD, for example, a maximum of 10 participants is quite common. If you're doing an MSc project and you're doing a relatively short form dissertation and using something like a generic thematic analysis, then maybe we're talking about 15 to 20 participants, but that number would be increased significantly for doctoral studies if you were using something relatively basic like thematic analysis. If you get into discourse analysis or narrative analysis, again, the question or the answer to the question how many is very different. So it really is important to make sure that you know your broader setup methodologically before you work out what sort of numbers of participants you need. And it is also where you are drawing those from. In some studies, a snowballing approach in which participants recommend other participants may be absolutely fine. You may have relatively few entry criteria, so to speak. Maybe it's just the type of work that someone does, or that they've attended a particular event. But if the more fine-grained your requirements are in terms of participation, if you want people who have had a particular length of experience, for example, in an organisation or an occupation, then the more specific your recruitment mechanisms will need to be. And then the other ethical issue to bear in mind is different types of interviewee may require more support, and the interview might need more scaffolding around it, depending on what those are. We only ever, Helen and I, in our research, interview those over 18. Certainly if you're working in a sort of management school or a business school, and working within organisations, there would often be no need to be talking to people who are under 18. But if you are researching widely in the social sciences, then you need to be aware of the very specific requirements, which may vary by country, as to the age of sort of eligibility in which someone is able to give informed consent. Vulnerability is a particularly challenging concept because we need to be careful of imposing frameworks, again, of vulnerability, assuming that someone might not be able to give informed consent or might be perceived as being vulnerable. And your own ethics systems in your own institutions or organisations should be providing you with guidance on that. It's really important to note that you need to follow whatever systems are in place. They may be institutional or some fields of research. So if you're in sociology or organisational psychology, for example, you will also have governing body regulations around ethics. And we say here, to the powerful organisational executive, in my experience, they can also be or feel quite vulnerable or feel exposed in a research interview. So don't make too many judgments from the outset about the person you're interviewing in terms of how you feel they may need support. That's something that you will need to monitor as you go through the interview itself. So there's lots in it. Common challenges. I don't know, Helen, you're in the chat. I don't know if you've seen whether we've got some more common challenges here that are coming up here. Whether anyone else has got any issues here. We've talked about setup and getting things organised in advance, and we'll see a little bit later about how to deal with different types of participants in our highly skilled and advanced acting course, role play. But I think often the worries are that you won't get enough information or that you won't get the right information from a participant. And we'll talk in a minute about how to design an interview such that it doesn't feel too much like an interrogation, because you really don't want to be putting someone under a lot of pressure. You want it to feel like a conversation. There's a lot of discussion about naturalness, natural data, but you want it, and it never will be because it's an artificial setup, but you want it to feel like a good flowing conversation in which you can encourage and enable the participant to talk about the things that matter to them, which of course is what is important. They won't know necessarily what matters to you, but often in a qualitative interview, what we're actually trying to do is get them to talk about what matters to them. So you do need to be managing yourself, the interviewee, participant, and the process. So there's three things basically that you're trying to keep on top of as you go through. Is there anything else from the chat, Helen?
I think clearly I think we've got a very talented bunch, because there's not that many challenges in the chat. We've got knowing when to talk and not to talk.
Yeah.
Some kind of just limited experience of interviewing. We've got somebody who's got experience outside within. So we've got, prosecutor, so Brianna, hello, and saying maybe some crossover skills with the cross-examination of witness. I'll come back to that. The answer is yes, there are, but also there aren't. So I'll pick up on that point. And then asking questions about leading questions, which we've got quite a lot of stuff on as well. So
yeah, I mean, I think it's each interview is a separate. I mean, Helen's right. You will learn the more you do. But each interview is a separate sort of experience for both you and the participant. And there will be times where you make mistakes or you hear yourself saying something and you're thinking, I can't reel that one back. I can't take that back. Where am I going to go now? And it's not being too hard on yourself during the interview process. and that if you ask a question and as you're saying it, you can tell it's wrong, it's fine to say, let me just rephrase that for you, or, you know, and they're not expecting you to be, I mean, otherwise we'd be getting ChatGPT to do these, right? So they're not expecting you to be a sort of robot-like, you know, firing questions. Well, they might expect that, but that's not what the experience should be like. And you will make errors and mistakes and slips, or you'll get the words wrong, or you'll forget the organization you're supposed to be asking about. All these things will happen. And in some senses, those help create or can help create a relationship with the interviewee, because they're not expecting you and don't really want you to be this sort of robot-like person. Let's move on, and we might come back to some of these as we share your experiences of practice interviews as we go on.
Yeah, I think what we've done is
Helen.
sort of identified some of the key skills which are really great to develop, which will enhance your ability as an interviewer. But also, as you become more skilled with interviewing, you can really quickly, you can use, for example, a leading question to help open up the conversation, and know that you won't be able to use that data, but just know that it helps open up the participants. So we'll cover things like that, that as you become more confident in yourself when you're in the interview situation, the kinds of things that you can do to help, and the tools and techniques you can use to help in that situation. So we've kind of listed here some of the key skills which we feel are probably most necessary in helping you to conduct a great interview. And what do we mean by a great interview? An interview, essentially, I like looking at a transcript and seeing not many questions, very short probes being used, long participant answers with pauses and silences. And again, it's very much dependent on the type of research you're doing. But if you're doing in-depth qualitative research, and we have pretty much designed this training around the assumption that, you know, this is what a lot of people want to do, and collect really great data, and that requires a particular style of interviewing. So we've got designing interview questions and the structure of your interview, setting up your interview, which we think is probably the most important part. And again, we've got an exercise to show you for that. This idea of coaching a participant rather than leading your participant. This is where the setup becomes really important, because, and for those of you that do job interviews, this can also be a really helpful technique. Before I came into the bright and shiny world of academia, my job was to train interviewers and to interview people and to conduct what are known as behavioural event interviews, 2 to 3 hour interviews, which are designed to build a profile. So a lot of these techniques sort of come from a mixture of our experiences as researchers, and also our experiences in terms of training interviewers as well. One of the most important things here is this idea between active and passive listening. Really good interviewing is really tiring, and because you are constantly having to really listen, and I will pick up on this and what that means, but really listen to what your participant is saying. And that requires some different types of skills, and also from a cognitive perspective can be exceptionally tiring. So for those who may be neurodivergent, it's about, if you're planning to do interviews, you want to do in-depth interviewing and you get tired, you know, build that into your own structure. Don't have long interviews, maybe have a couple of different ones that have short sections where you give yourself a break and the participant a break. So these are the kind of things you might need to think about and plan for if you want to do this kind of research. Navigating emotions. For those of you that might be doing research with vulnerable groups or on sensitive topics, you are giving a participant a chance to sit down and possibly open up about things they may never have talked about in that amount of depth. That's not only a huge privilege, but it's also can be really hard to navigate that from both the participant's perspective and also from your own perspective, particularly if you've not dealt with that situation before. So we've got a few tips on that. And then finally, nobody talks about what you do at the end of an interview. The start and the beginning are really important. That is what often your participant is left with an impression with. So ending that interview and allowing that conversation, you know, particularly if you've been talking for, 2 hours about a really vulnerable and sensitive topic, and then going, oh, see you later, ending that interview in a really sensitive and thoughtful way is really important. So we'll talk about the debrief a little bit later.
Would you like to move to the next slide, Helen?
Next slide, please, Katrina. Thank you.
You're welcome, Helen.
Okay, so achieving depth. The key, if you're going to be conducting interviews, then you often, the reason why you want to do interviews to get more depth than you would in other qualitative techniques such as questionnaires, etc. It gives you a chance to really tackle subjects in more detail than perhaps you would otherwise. So how do you achieve depth? I like to use the analogy of duck diving. I want you to sort of think of the interview of different levels. You have your descriptive level, and this is the same with all data. And when we talk about analysis in our session on Wednesday, this will make even more sense. So generally, most people converse at the descriptive level, what are called quite generalized levels. And your job as an interviewer is to get somebody to go beyond that kind of descriptive generalized level. Generally, I do this, generally, I do that. Oh, yeah, they were sad. Oh, I think they were happy. You know, you generally sort of that kind of descriptive. So your duck is swimming along the surface. But to get beyond those generalizations, beyond what we call the day-to-day speak, your job is to use probes to help get below the surface. And this is really where the skill comes in, is to how to use those probes to get below the surface. So what we really want to develop today is people's understanding of duck diving, getting below the surface, getting below the descriptive layers of that day-to-day conversation. Next slide, please. So one of the ways I like to get people to think about this is when you're conducting an interview, an in-depth interview, and to help participants, this can be a really good analogy. I use it all the time to get them to understand, and this is where this coaching versus leading comes in. You know, you want to try and help train your participant to respond in the interview, and this requires a bit of work up front. So you almost want to tell your participant that I want you to imagine that I'm following you around with a camera. And that when I'm asking you particular questions, it's because I really want to understand and build the detail. I want to understand where you were. Imagine that I'm the fly on the wall. Who was there? Who was talking? How did you feel? How did they feel? Tell me a little about the space you were in. That kind of depth. So just imagine that I'm following you around with a camera. And when you're thinking about how to achieve depth in your own interviews, it's a really useful analogy to think about is you really want to know what's going on in that particular event, that particular incident, or within that particular experience that you're interviewing about. So this sort of documentary maker analogy is not only helpful for you to understand what depth looks like in an interview context, but also when you're helping to train that participant at the beginning to get them to understand what you need. You'll often hear the term when participants use, is that okay? Is that what you wanted to hear? A lot of the time, the participant wants to please you as an interviewer. They don't know what you want. So setting that up front can be really helpful. And I find the documentary analogy can be really useful to help participants understand that you are just really nosy and you really want to get that detail. And it's important for what you're trying to get out of the research. Next slide, please.
Just to add, I think when an interviewer, Helen's absolutely right, often say, is this what you need? Am I giving you the right sort of stuff? To be honest and reinforce that. And often people will think that you don't need the detail or that you don't want the detail and will tempted to say, am I going into too much detail? To which the answer is nearly always, no, this is absolutely great.
Yeah.
I will now move to the next slide.
And when people talk about doing semi-structured interviews, it makes my tummy flip a little bit because I find if someone says to me doing a semi-structured interview, that means they've just asked a list of questions. Sometimes they're a little bit leading, a little bit too direct. And generally where you want to achieve that depth is by starting off asking a broad question about a particular event, about a particular experience, which is linked to your research question. And then you use these probes to help achieve that duck dive, that depth. And your participant will not be used to this approach to begin with, and it's your job as an interviewer, and this is where the skill comes in. It's your job as an interviewer to set that up for your participant. Sometimes I'm going to be interrupting you. It may feel a little bit weird to begin with, but it's only because I'm really interested in what you want to hear, and it will help direct you as to what, where we want to go in the interview. So setting that up is really important. So what we've given you, and we've got a pack to put into the chat shortly, is a list of really useful probes to use in an interview. You notice about all of them is that they're all really short. And that's because long questions can be really confusing. And often in an interview situation, the shorter the question, the better. So you start off with your open, broad question. Tell me about a time when, talk to me about that X, talk to me about Y, and then you use your probes to navigate through, remember that camera analogy, navigate through the example. A participant might talk about a particular person and you might choose to zoom in on that. You know, oh, can we just zoom in that individual for a moment? Tell me, how did you respond then? What was your thinking behind saying that? Or just take me back, rewind back. I like to use the documentary analogy so it helps them really feel like where we are. Just rewind back to that moment then. So now this requires two things, probing. It requires you to actively listen. So you need to be aware of what the participant is saying at all times. And what I always do when I'm interviewing is I always have a notepad, and I like to use spider diagrams, generally that no one else can understand. When I'm interviewing, what I'll do is I won't write down everything the participant is saying, but I'll note down key words that they've said about a particular event, about a particular example, maybe a particular description. So for example, the sun was really hot on that day, and I'll write down, you know, sun really hot on, you know, that Tuesday in the example. And I'll say, oh, just rewind back. You told me that the sun was really hot then. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? You know, what do you mean by hot? So what you're doing is you are just identifying words that have been said, active listening, using that, rephrasing that into a question, and then using a probe to take the participant back to achieve a little bit more depth beyond what's been said. And that's the key, is it's not just about what the participant says. Your job is to take them beyond that, beyond the everyday conversation. And probing is a key skill in doing that. And we're going to come back to that later. Next slide, please, Katrina.
Can I just add something, Helen, before we move
Yes.
on? One of the things that if you are interviewing in an organisation that you work in or that you are very familiar with, there is we haven't covered it particularly here, we will do in our session on reflexivity. She says, writing that down. This idea of being an insider or an outsider with the person that you're interviewing can give you some clues as to how to use probes, because if you are working in the organisation you're interviewing in, there will be an assumption of a common understanding of key stories and events and things that happen, and you will need to coach the interviewee to treat you a bit more like an outsider, to explain some things. So it is a little bit using the documentary analogy, I would sometimes also say, you used an acronym, whatever it is, or you talked a little about, could you just explain, as though I don't know what that is, you tell me what that means to you. So you don't be afraid to stop and pick up on some terms. But if you're an outsider, and this happened to me when I was doing interviews with rail engineers, and there were lots of acronyms, it is important to know what they're talking about and to make sure that you've done your homework, so that if someone says, oh, there was a SPAD on Tuesday and it was really serious, that I don't have to probe every time to say, could you explain to me what a SPAD is? I know that it's signal passed at danger, which I still remember from so many years ago. So you will have to do a little bit of homework to make sure that you understand how your participants talk and the sort of language that they use, what the organisational terms are that you're likely to come across. And that is why, again, we touch on it briefly, but why piloting is really important and can help you get through some of that.
Yeah, and just to pick up on, there's a question coming in the chat.
Sorry, I've gone back.
The use of why. So we really discourage the use of why. And that is because why can come across and be perceived as quite judgmental. And the whole point of questioning is it's not your job as an interviewer to judge what the participant is saying. And when you say, oh, why did you feel that way? Or why did you do that? It can come across and be perceived as judgmental. And so generally we have a rule of just avoiding why. And, you know, there are lots of other ways of, and also it's quite closed and can be quite closed when you use it. So just training yourself to avoid that why. And also sometimes when you're in a conversation, your tone and the way that you phrase questions can be really important. And I'll just give you an example now. Oh, how did that make you feel? How did that make you feel? Completely different. Same if you use a why. Oh, why did you do that? Versus, oh, can you tell me a little bit more about that and your thinking behind that, please? So completely different. And if you are involved in an interview on the other side of the table, if you're being interviewed, it's a really good practice to actually get somebody to ask you the why versus the, tell me your thinking behind that, because you will see the difference. So it's just generally good practice to avoid why questions, and just try and really think about using those probes. And it's really hard to do at first because it feels really unnatural, and that's why you have to almost train your participant to begin with, and say in that setup, I am going to be interrupting you and using at times it is going to feel like a little bit like talking to somebody really, really nosy, but it's only because I'm really interested in particular details that you're telling me. And the participant will get used to it, and really, really, you'll know when you've been in a good interview, and particularly this is the thing about job interviews, you've been in a really good job interview because you've had a really skilled interviewer who has been able to navigate the interview and get the evidence from you rather than you having to do the work. It's not the participant's job to provide you with all the evidence you need. It's your job as an interviewer. And that's why we put so much emphasis onto training and using these techniques, because at the end of the day, if you want rich quality data, it's not your participant's fault if you haven't got it at the end of the interview. It's because you haven't used the right techniques.
I can't think now that there isn't a single interview that I ever do that doesn't involve the phrase, could you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah.
And another thing, if they've told you quite a lot about a detail and you do an event and you still don't feel like you're getting it, another way to summarize is, well, it sounds like that was a positive experience, or that was a negative experience. Could you tell me about one that perhaps went a little bit differently, or was a bit more challenging, or was a bit more enjoyable, or whatever the alternate is? So you can switch these around a bit to help navigate through. So if you feel like you're getting, perhaps someone's talking about all the negative things or all the positive things, and you need the switch. Sorry, Helen, I'll move on there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this links to what we're saying here about managing you as an interviewer. And this can be really challenging. And also there are some probes which don't always work as well as others with particular forms of cognitive differences or neurodivergencies. For example, asking lots of emotion and feeling questions with particular individuals, they may not have the ability to think or reflect in the ways that you may think that you do. So it's really important to listen, to judge that participant. I've been involved, and we've both been involved with participants who are present with different forms of neurodivergencies. And there are some questions and some probes which are not understood in particular ways, and that's because you've not asked the right question in the way that they can then answer you. So an example, just recently with a participant is asking questions like, how did that make you feel? Well, they might not reflect with regards to emotions or think about emotions in the same way, in which case it's your job to ask differently. Tell me a bit about what happened in that scenario. Was there anything that was unusual or stood out to you about that scenario? So you just change the questioning to adapt to the participant's needs. That's really important. And being aware of your facial expression. I do this a lot in interviews. I do a lot of nodding. I do a lot of yeah, okay, I do that on purpose. I know I do it, and I do it to encourage the participant, particularly in an online environment where the participant isn't in the room with you, and they can't see your hands, they can't see your body, so other visual cues that some people pick up on. If you're in a room with an individual, it's really important not to have closed off body language. Never fold your arms, lean on the table, have your notes out, and just say, I'm just writing notes about the interview where the participant can see them. Otherwise, they might feel a bit nervous that, what are you writing, but like a doctoral clinical notes. So these are little things which can help the participant feel more comfortable, but require a level of awareness that you need to think through to help that. So thinking about how you're going to be perceived by participants can be really important. I always told participants in an online space where I am, so I'm in Wales, say it's nice and sunny, or the rain's really piling down, and I have that sort of kind of rapport and build up just beforehand. If my dog barks in the background, I go, oh, that's my mischievous dog, and really, you might hear her several times through the interview, and then they'll say, well, I've got, a deadly cat that might attack me halfway through. These are the kind of little bits of conversation which you can use that help build up a little bit of rapport, take away the emphasis of this being like, I always say this isn't like a formal or job interview at all. And I almost go a little bit overly informal sometimes, just to try and help the participant feel like they're in a more of a comfortable space. The role and tone of your voice can be really important. I talk quite fast sometimes, and I use a lot of tone. I use a lot of inflection when I'm speaking, and I really try and moderate that when I'm interviewing, and particularly when I'm asking questions. So, for example, a participant recently got quite upset in an interview, and rather than, move on to the next question, you just say, are you all right? Do you want to just take a little bit of time? I can understand, I can see, you're quite upset there. Do you want to just take a little bit of time, rather than fluster and say, do you want to just stop? I can see, it's obviously hard, etc. Just manage yourself, manage the interview, manage the time with that. Really, really important to do. The other thing is, and this can be sometimes more challenging for some people rather than others. So I just want to emphasize that this is guidance, but matching the energy of a participant can be a bit of a skill. And one of the things that I would watch out for is how fast somebody talks and the energy levels that they present in both an online and in-person space. Sometimes you'll get people who will just talk really fast and are like really excited and just, oh, this is so great. Haven't talked about this in ages. And, and then you as an interview go, oh, tell me a little bit more about that. What I do is I tend to match their level of energy. Or if I have someone who's a little bit slower, and by that I mean they're taking time to really think and reflect because they've not thought about it a long time, I manage it completely differently. I take a step back, I just look a bit more confident, I nod my head, I write some pretend notes like, oh, I'm really feeling awkward at this really long, awkward silence, but I'm going to let them take that. So you're managing the energy levels and the pace of your participant the whole time and trying to match that. Again, trying to kind of keep them feeling comfortable, that you're not requiring anything from them, and that very much, you're in control of the interview, but you're not controlling the interviewee. It's a hard balance to meet. Katrina, did you have anything to add?
Yes, I think obviously I have something to add. I think the difference if you're interviewing someone quite senior in an organisation, or somebody who, particularly if you've spent quite a long time securing access to someone and you can feel quite anxious about the interview yourself, and you have to gauge quite quickly at the start of the interview whether they are expecting it to be very formal or whether they're happy to go for a more relaxed vibe, for want of a better word. And sometimes you have to build to a more relaxed vibe. They will soften as the interview goes on, but they might want to be quite formal at the start. So there is quite a lot of not judging in advance what you think someone's going to be like, but working it out how relaxed they're going to be, and how some people will and I have had this in interviews where they expect you to be deferential to them because of their role in an organization, and that's possibly one of the trickiest dynamics. And so you do end up in those cases doing a little bit more phrasing and I'm sure you're very busy, thank you so much for the time you've taken, and I understand you played a leading role in this project. Could you tell me a little bit more about that? So you might sort of ramp up the sort of the slightly more formal language, but it is just something that you learn how to do with practice. And again, that's why doing some sort of pilots where you think about that is really helpful.
And using those, I'm just reading the chat actually, some of the things, so you want to try and avoid leading in enabling your participant to talk. You also want to avoid leading them. And by that, if a participant says, yeah, it was a really challenging time, you can say it was a really challenging time. What you can't do is, if the participant hasn't told you that it was hard or challenging or whatever synonym that matches that sort of experience was, is you can't make an assumption what that experience was from that participant. Your job is to use a probe. So can you tell me how you felt about that time, or tell me a bit more about the experience? You use the word hard. Can you tell me a little bit about what you meant by that word? And then you can make an assumption as to what that event was like. So just a point on that. And the other point on using sort of the kind of verbal cues, and obviously this was written by a dyslexic, as you can see, which is why cues is spelt cues as in not cues. That's just the way it is. So in terms of that, you want to try and avoid leading a participant, things like interesting, just okay, yes, or using a probe, tell me how you felt, or I'm just going to move us on to the next question if that's okay. So again, checking for that consent while you're doing that. The key point, last point really on this slide, is that we are all biased. We all have biases. You can't get rid of those biases. They're with us. They're there for a reason. They enable us to make particular decisions, some better than others. Still haven't won the lottery. So the key thing is managing those biases within the interview. You can't get rid of them. They're there for a reason. You embrace them we embrace bias within qualitative research. So the point is you as an interviewer, and your role with, you know, making notes and field notes and etc. about the interview, is to have a real understanding of what they might be. And I mean biases in the broadest possible sense, even right down to what might make you feel anxious, what might make you feel, you know, uncomfortable in an interview. Some things participants might say might make you feel uncomfortable. For example, I had a participant who was openly quite homophobic in an interview, and was making quite deliberate comments. It made me feel very, I didn't say anything, etc., but it made me feel very uncomfortable in that particular, this was a while ago, in that particular instance. I've had participants in my previous life, I've had candidates talk about quite explicit issues around workplace issues, around sexual harassment, things like that, which are very uncomfortable topics. And again, it's just about navigating that. A key tip, if you're interviewing people who are more senior, is about that managing the interview. You are managing the time, you're managing the questioning, allowing that space. So it's really important. That's why practice is everything when it comes to doing an interview and managing an interview well.
Just to pick up, Jen's put some useful comments in the chat, which have sort of, you know, answered in there. But I think it did make us think that if you feel in an interview that you yourself are at any risk, or you are distressed, or your safety is compromised, then that is the paramount factor in what's happening. If you feel so uncomfortable that you are experiencing distress, then you should leave the interview. You should not stick it out. And there are, if you're online, it's very convenient because unfortunately your internet might crash and you can just get out of it that way. And then you should, if you're being supervised, immediately talk to your supervisor, who should always know when and where you're interviewing, or that have a colleague like Helen and I always know when we're interviewing, if we need to talk to each other. If you're in person, it's a little trickier to extricate yourself. But you know, the standard thing, someone should always know where you are. You should never go anywhere private that you don't know. It's always better to be in a public space, or if you're in an organization, make sure that people know that you're there, and that at least there are windows onto the place that you are. And if you need to leave, then you need to leave, and how you extricate yourself may depend on whether you need to interview anyone else in the office. But if you don't, then I think it's fine to say, I'm very sorry, but I need to close the interview now, and I will contact you with the appropriate debriefs and finish the interview. And you know, if you're interviewing other people in that organization, that is a slightly more tricky thing. But you know,
yeah, just a tip on that. So one of the techniques that I often used to use I would say, right, I've just got one final question for you, if that's right. Is there, you know, one other thing that you'd like to add to the interview, and just ask a closed question, or, you know, how did you find the interview? Just ask it, or relatively, or did you enjoy the interview, as a closed question, just one final question. And you say, thank you very much. You know, that was really great. If you feel uncomfortable, just stopping the interview there and then, because of the dynamic with the participant, one really great is just preparing the participant and saying, you know, this one final question, asking a closed question, and then saying, thank you very much. That was great. And then, you know, stop recording, do whatever you need to do and get out. Just if you feel that kind of that stop would be uncomfortable for you to do, that's one of the techniques that I used to use, and it used to work quite well.
The most important thing is not to stay. If you are in distress, uncomfortable, you feel that your safety is compromised, it is really important that you know that nothing is worth staying at that point for.
Yeah.
Are we next sliding?
We are into part 2.
Oh.
Okay, so now we're just going to focus specifically on those skills in practice. So thinking about what you actually need to be doing in an interview. Many of you here may have heard of critical incident technique, and Brianna, in cross-examination, a lot of those techniques are drawn from critical incident techniques in terms of the levels of questioning that you use, etc. And a lot of the techniques you will find there'll be a lot of crossover, and where they stop is obviously, you know, what you're actually doing in the context that you're doing it in, and being, you know, really aware of what data you're drawing from the participant in the process. So explicitation sort of sits under, and critical incident techniques are a group of it's not one technique, which is one of my other bugbears. So it's not one technique, it's a group of techniques that are used to extract, horrible word, data from a participant, and more specifically in-depth data. Generally, it focuses around a specific event, a specific experience, or a specific incident. This can also be really helpful from a research perspective, that you often frame your questions around a specific event or specific instance. For example, our research part of our current research looks at disclosure at work. So how people disclose marginalised identities or stigmatised identities at work. So our questions, our broad questions, are framed about specific events around disclosure. So can you tell me about a time where you may have had to reveal part of yourself at work? Your broad question, you know, can you tell me about any challenges that may have come about as a result of your identities or disclosing your identities? So you frame them around these specific instance, specific events. And this is where the explicitation technique comes in. So these are groups of techniques that you use to draw out that level of what we call retrospective introspection, which is retrospection is about reflection, so thinking back about a particular event. And these are events or incidents or experiences that your participants may have never thought about in this amount of depth before. And then that introspection is where the probes come in. So introspection is about really getting participants to focus on specific aspects of that and really unpack their thinking, their thoughts, their feelings of that particular incident. You are the guide, the coach in that instance, that documentary maker, designed to draw out that level of introspection needed. And this comes from, you know, they always cause problems, these psychologists, but a lot of these techniques are drawn from a lot of Carl Rogers' work, sort of person-centered approaches and talking therapies. So how do you get people to really think about themselves in a particular incident, in a particular event? Well, a lot of that's about guided questions and targeted questions. And those open questions that you're not leading a participant to think about something in a particular way. The whole point is you want them to give you their own thoughts, their own descriptions, their own interpretations of that particular event. And the whole idea with explicitation is that getting that degree of granularity, that detail. You can move on, it's fine, Katrina. Is to gain that granularity, that detail. And I'm going to come back to that granularity in just a second.
Sorry, you took a breath and I thought you finished. So designing interview questions, it is quite a skill, I think I would say. Nearly everybody that I supervise at whatever level, the first thing that they do is write about 25 questions for an hour interview. And that is because sometimes you are worried that you will forget what the important things are that you want to get from the interview. And so it is really about trying to find some overarching questions that you then follow up with the probes that we've already discussed. So we often have sort of 3 to 5, I mean, 3 is a bit short, sort of 5, 6 questions that are an interview. And those are the only questions that we would ask. It also is surprisingly much easier to manage with fewer questions because you're not constantly trying to look at your notes or your interview guide to say, oh, am I on question 6 or question 16 or question 24? And often I will find that with a well-navigated interview, you will get through all the areas without actually asking the questions, because you want your participant to be doing much more of the talking than you are, and thinking about, you know, just asking about opportunities and challenges, or asking about, you know, their best experience of work versus their, you know, the most challenging, or whatever the context is, will give you quite a lot to work with then with the probes. This is why we always advise people that we're supervising at whatever level to pilot the interview questions, even an informal pilot. So sitting down with just a friend or a colleague to say, well, these are my rough questions. If I was to ask them to you, roughly, you know, what sort of things do you think you would talk about? Because while it's important to keep questions open, you can find yourself closing down a question too much if you make it really, really specific. And then you can get stuck because it's sort of like you navigate yourself to a dead end, and you sort of have to backtrack away. So there isn't a general rule of the number of questions, but fewer rather than more, and really try not to make it feel like an interrogation, asking broader questions and talking about events, as Helen's already mentioned. So before we interview, we've had a little bit of chat about this on the chat about researcher safety. Research ethics are as much about protecting the researcher as they are not quite as much, but they are as protecting the researcher is as important as protecting the participant. So you should always tell someone, particularly if you are, I mean, that's not a great photo of an interview setup, is it? You should always let someone know where you're going if you're physically going to an interview, and make sure that you are happy that the location you are going to is safe for you. Having your, I haven't got my dictaphone around, but having whatever you need, whether it's a notepad, pen, paper, some recording device, and making sure that you know where you're going, leaving enough time to park your car or to get the train or whatever it is. The last thing you want to be doing as an interview is arriving flustered. Better to arrive and have time to sort of, you know, go to the loo, have a drink beforehand. Make sure that you do have some form of contact number. So if you do get unexpectedly delayed, there is a traffic jam or the train is cancelled or whatever, that you can just let someone know that you're going to be half an hour late. Is it okay to do it at that later time? And also having and tracking your participant communication, knowing that you set up, sending them the questions in advance is absolutely fine. We quite often do that, or at least an indication of the questions in advance. People like to feel that they can prepared, and obviously keeping that communication going. And we'll come on to I think we'll come on to debriefs in a little bit. I think we've talked about this quite a lot, and I'm conscious of a little bit of time. But it is really important that you may not know what someone's needs are until you actually start the interview. And that should be part of the rapport building at the start, just to check that they're comfortable. Is there anything else that they'd like you to be aware of before you start? And just making sure that, you know, I mean, those might be, as Helen said, it might be that they've got a small child at home or a dog, or that they're expecting a delivery at 30:30 or 10:31 or whatever precise time, that they're going to need to take a break, that they might want to do something. Sending materials in advance. I think we do send our questions in advance. We send obviously an information sheet and the consent form. We send all those in advance. If you are thinking about doing some form of interview in which the participant needs to do something in advance, you want them to draw a timeline, or you want them to take a picture, or you want them to do whatever it is, do something in advance, do bear in mind that most of them won't. You nearly always need a contingency plan in that case. I've often gone into interviews where someone said, you know, the first thing someone says is, I'm really sorry, I haven't had any time to prepare. Was I supposed to do something? So you almost need to have sort of option A and option B then in your interview setup to work out if it is going to be okay to carry on to do it without whatever it was that you wanted. I did some interviews where they needed to bring their smartphones with them. Most of them did, because people carry their phones around with them anyway, but some people didn't, or they didn't have their work one that we wanted to access, or them to access to look at stuff on it. So, you know, I mean, you just have to have a backup. and knowing when to stop. Do be mindful of the time. If you've told someone an interview is going to take an hour and you've got 50 minutes in and you're going strong, at an appropriate point say, I'm conscious that we said this would only run till 11 o'clock, but it looks like we've got a discussion going here. Are you okay to carry on past that time, or will we need to wrap up at 11? And obviously of your own time as well. If it's going great guns and it's a really rich vein of data, it's fine to say, I think we'll have to stop shortly, but I'd really like to come back and follow up this discussion with a second interview. Would that be okay? Sometimes you do that and the second one then doesn't go anywhere near where the first one was going. So it's ideal if you can to carry on. So don't ever book yourself into interviews back to back. Don't book 10, 11, 12, 1, 2. I mean, don't do that many in a day anyway, but always leave yourself at least half an hour grace for expecting that it might be going to run on. Generally we tell our participants about an hour, but prepare them for the fact that it might be longer. Is there anything else you wanted to add, Helen? I'm slightly going quickly through these because I think we've touched on some of this and I'm conscious of time.
Yeah, I'd move on. Okay, so I'm going to go quite quickly through this because we're going to do a setup for you, and specifically with in mind that a lot of interviews are happening online now, so our view is really tailoring it within that online environment. But the setup is the most important part. When we talked about coaching your participant, managing expectations is key. For those of you that also may do lots of job interviews, you should always manage expectations at the beginning. The number of times I wish I could train people to do better job interviews. Anyway, moving on. So in-person setups, obviously this requires a bit more logistics. It's all about creating the right space, physical space for that interview. So making sure you check if you're doing field work and you're going to site. Again, I'm not going to go through any of the safety aspects. I think we've covered that, but making sure that where you're going is suitable for an interview. I ended up doing an interview in a hairdresser's on the floor of a hairdresser's, which ended up being very itchy because there was a lot of hair on the floor, but it was the only suitable space that was available. I'd always take my own water and a spare bottle of water for the participant. I'd always take pens, etc., etc. I'll talk a little bit more about using elicitation tools and some of the challenges in that in just a second. But managing those expectations is key, and those points that you cover in the setup are what we're going to go through in just a second, and that's really important. And doing the same for each participant is really important too, so that you can understand what your participants' needs are. I had a participant that wanted their camera off because they suffered from fibromyalgia and fatigue, and staring at the screen and being on a nearer screen really disadvantaged them, and they didn't want that. So we had the camera turned off, and that was absolutely fine. But that required, the participant didn't voluntarily tell me that to begin with. I just asked at the beginning, is there anything that we can do to make this a better space for you? And that was in an online context. And the participant said, would it be all right if I turn my camera off? Yeah, of course, whatever helps you. Similarly, asking for other aspects too, which I'll cover in just a second. So really key is just noting down and having a setup. I would always have a sheet with a list of things that I wanted to go through at the beginning of every interview, and I would tick it, and I make sure I tick it off. So talking about consent, talking about research project, talking about time and how long it's going to take, talking about interruptions, the types of questions, etc. So have your setup and have it on a sheet of paper with you for every interview so that you don't miss things off, particularly if you're nervous and you've not been doing it much before. Next slide, please. So this is just a picture of some of the elicitation interviews I did using Lego in my PhD. You can see this required quite a lot of setup. It required quite a lot of logistics involved. I'm not going to go into in a huge amount of detail about this now, but this involved a lot of thinking and how to use that setup time. I use that setup time with participants to build rapport, to give them a little bit of information about that. So if you're using different tools and different techniques in an interview, it requires you to really think through what you're doing. It required a lot of time to clean the hair off this Lego after my interview in the hairdressers, but actually that's where the individual felt most comfortable, and it worked really well. So you can see here the before and after of the interview. And so the setup time was a time for us to talk, and we talked quite a lot about of sensitive topics, etc. So that debrief time was also when we cleared up and I talked to the participant and have that kind of cool off time with them. So it's a really nice beginning and an end of the interview. Just an example, if you're using different tools, how you can build that into your setup and cool down your kind of debrief time in your interview. So the same applies in an online environment. Just a few more things to think about in an online environment. Yes, it's easier from a logistical perspective in that you're not having to travel to particular spaces. It can be much better for participants who may be vulnerable or feel much more comfortable in their own spaces and own environments, particularly if they're opening up about personal topics. Being in their own space can be far more conducive to them and much more helpful to them. It might be great for you, but the most important thing is that participants feel comfortable and they feel safe in that they can, in what they're communicating, and that what they're communicating will be treated with respect and confidentiality. So test your connection, really important. Make sure you have a stable Wi-Fi connection, and also make sure in any communication with your participant that they understand that that's what's needed too. Interruptions happen. Again, prepare your participant for that. We might get disconnected. If that happens, just use the same Zoom link and pop back in, or use the same Teams link and pop back in. Or if there's any issues and you can't connect to me, pop me an email. Ensure that when you are recording and you record using Zoom or Teams, the participant is aware that a video recording is also taken. Unless you have specifically said that you are using visual and video data, please delete the video recording after the interview. You have not got consent for that, and you should also make sure your participants are aware of that too. That's really important. You should also give the participant the option to have their camera off at the beginning of the interview too, if they wish to, and that's something that you might need to just prepare for if you're someone who really takes a lot from visual cues. You know, for example, also if you have a participant who is hearing impaired or deaf, you want to make sure they can specifically use closed captions, or you as a researcher may need to use closed caption yourself, in which case make your participant aware of that, and that it's okay, and that this is a space that you want to create and make as comfortable as possible. I think I've covered most points in there. Oh, in most important things, try and be relaxed, even though you might feel nervous and etc. Your job is to control the space and create that right environment. So that's where that practice and that piloting is key, because you want to make sure that you are feeling relaxed, because then your participant hopefully will also start to relax as the interview progresses. It may not be right at the beginning, but certainly by the end of the interview, there should be that kind of change in dynamic towards the end. Whew. Okay, I think I got through that quite well. So
we are, oh, go on.
No, you go.
Well, I'm going to stop sharing the slides, I think, so we can do this. Is that?
Yeah, I'm going to pin up.
Right, if you, I'm going to stop share.
There we go. Spotlighted us. Okay, so what we're going to do now is just demonstrate a setup in an online environment. So Katrina's going to be Katrina, not going to be any form of difficult participant. Or might be, I don't know, you can surprise me if you want. Okay, you're going to surprise me. So we're just going to demonstrate the setup of an online interview, and sort of what to expect at the beginning and things to think about when you are just starting the interview. So again, just observe, interested to know if you've had similar experiences, etc. So put them in the chat. So we've just popped on and we're going to get started. Hi, Katrina, thanks so much for joining me today.
Oh, hi, nice to meet you.
Oh, it's great to meet you too. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me.
It's really okay.
Oh, great. Whereabouts are you?
I'm in Penarth.
Oh, lovely. What's the weather like in Penarth?
Yeah, mixed at the moment. Bits of blue sky, but you know, it's a bit chilly.
Oh, okay. Well, it's quite sunny with me at the moment, but you know, it can always change. It is Wales, so
Wales after all, yes.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. So tell me, how much have you read? I sent some details to you before this interview.
Did you?
Oh, you've not had a chance to read them?
Oh, I'm so sorry. They might have gone into my junk mail. Shall I go and look them now?
No, don't worry at all. If you don't mind, I'll tell you a little bit about the research and what to expect.
That'd be helpful.
And I'll also go through a little bit in terms of consent as well. We take that very seriously. It's really important to us. So I'll just go through a few details if that's all right.
Yes, that's fine. That's great.
So This research is by Breaking Binaries, and it's funded by the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development, and it's about disclosure at work, specifically disclosure of stigmatized identities.
Oh yes, I remember that now when I signed up and contacted you. Yes,
great. Oh, fantastic. Right. So we're doing a number of different interviews with participants based all over the UK in different industries as well. And I'm really interested to hear about your own experiences within work. And so the interview is going to be exploring that. So I've got a number of questions to ask you, which are focused on those experiences, and just gives you a chance really to talk to me about them. And we've got about an hour planned, and I've got around sort of 3 broad questions to ask you, if that's okay.
Yes, that's fine. Are we going to start now?
Not yet.
Oh, okay.
I love the fact you're keen. So when I ask you questions, it might feel a bit strange at first, and like you're talking to someone who's really nosy. So it's not like your traditional job interview.
I work with lots of nosy people, so I'm used to that.
Oh, brilliant. So what might happen is I might interrupt you now and again, and it might feel a little bit strange at first, but hopefully you'll get used to it. And it's just really because I'm interested to hear a little bit more detail about something you might be talking about. But again, feel free to ask me questions throughout the interview. Does that sound okay to you?
Yeah, that's fine.
Great. And I don't think you had a chance to look through the consent form.
Was that in the email that's in my junk box?
Yes, yes.
No,
so what I'll do is I'll just share my screen now and just go through some of those points with you. But I'll send that to you after the interview. So once you've had a chance to reflect on what you've discussed, then have another read through. And if you'd like to give consent, sign that and send it. I'd just like to state that you do not have to give your consent if you choose to withdraw. It's absolutely your choice. You just need to pop me an email saying you'd like to withdraw.
I'm sure it'll be fine.
Well, have a few days after the interview and just make sure, because you don't know what you're going to talk about. So
that's true.
Yeah, absolutely. So am I okay just to record the interview? Do I have your consent to do the interview and just verbally?
Yeah, that's fine.
Oh, fantastic. So I'm going to record the interview. I'm also going to record it on my dictaphone. This is Dora the Explorer, just because I don't trust technology. So I'm going to record it on here too. We will be recording a video recording. I don't want to see my face afterwards, so I'm going to delete that straight after, if that's all right.
That's a good idea. Yeah.
So just the final point is with your data. So your audio will be transcribed to a text format, and then Katrina or I will be analysing your data. Your data will be fully anonymised, so any places, any names, any geographical locations, any organisational names will be anonymised, so it'll be fully confidential. So feel free to speak as freely as you want, and you can swear as much as you like. Great. So do I have your permission to record the interview?
Yes, you do.
Fantastic. Thanks, Katrina. So I'll just press record. Okay. So, and then we'll get going.
And we're stopping there.
Yeah.
So one of the things, interestingly, that I do slightly differently is sometimes it depends a little bit. If they haven't done the consent form in advance, I quite often record the bit of them giving consent and have this strange conversation saying, I'm about to ask you if you'll give me permission to record, but do you mind if I record you giving permission to record or not, so that I've got that captured, just because it's a little bit easier, and then you've got it on the transcript. And if there is a problem with the consent form, you've at least made sure that you've got the permission to record logged on the interview. I'm going to go back to sharing the slides now, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so just to finish up before we move on to passing the exercise over to you guys to have a go, we've got a couple more things just to set up before we do that. So the final thing, obviously, is the importance of the debrief. So you may have been talking about some quite sensitive topics. It's important to allow time and space at the end of an interview for a debrief. We always provide a debrief form to participants, and this has normally a list of organisations that are relevant for seeking support for whatever the research is that you're looking at. So we look at, for example, the trans communities, so we have a lot of specific support for that. And what you'll find, and the key point is, you're not a therapist. Your job is not to solve your participants' problems. You're not trained for that, but you are responsible in terms of what harm may come to your participant as a result of the questions. So if your participant has experienced any distress, not stress, distress in your interview, it's really important to signpost them to those support, and to the support specifically, should they need it. And again, it's the responsibility of the participant to seek that support. Your job is simply to signpost them to it. Really important part of that. Sometimes in a follow-up email, when we send details afterwards, I'll just do a check-in and say, I hope you're okay after the interview. Just a reminder, if you do need support, do check the debrief form. There's some really great organisations on there, so you can just do a little bit of a check-in with that. Make notes about anything that's said during the debrief. Obviously, sometimes in the reflective space, participants will they'll go out of interview mode. You almost go, oh God, that was a lot of talking, wasn't it? I can't believe I haven't spoken about that in so long. It makes me feel really emotional just talking about that. So sometimes you might want to take notes. You can say, oh, do you mind if I just note that down? And they'll say, yeah, fine. Gosh, I just hadn't really thought about that in that time. So in that reflective space, participants can almost have like a bit of what I like to call chew time. They just sort of bit of word vomit and release themselves, because they've been in that kind of introspective space for sometimes, an hour to 2 hours. And again, just repeat those important points that you say right at the setup. Next steps, what's happening with their data, and that should also be in your debrief form. Informed consent, just a reminder, and then how to contact the research team should they need it. Again, all of that information should be in that form. Okay, so we're going to move then to the final part of today, where we just do, we're going to do a really brief example of probing with different types of participants and looking for the golden nuggets in the data. So all your research will have a number of research questions, and maybe one research question. And so there will be certain things in the data when you hear them, when a participant says something and you go, oh my God, this is it. This is fantastic. This is a paper title. And you kind of hear it. This is, fantastic. So we're going to give an example now of how to use those probes, but also how to manage those probes with 3 different types of participant. So
sorry,
we've got,
I'm going ahead.
Do we need that's this? Fine. Yeah, no, that's fine. So we're going to do a probing technique. We're going to do 3 different types of participant, and then we're going to ask you to go into breakout rooms of trios to have a practice with the setup and some probing. One thing I would say is, if you're uncomfortable being put in a breakout room, then please just stay in the main room, and we can kind of do some targeted stuff here. But just send us a direct message and we'll make sure that you're kind of not allocated to that. So because I know some people can be uncomfortable in those environments. So just let us know and we'll make sure that we kind of bring you back to the main room so you're not allocated to that. But just let us know. Okay, so we're just going to give you a quick example of probing with those kind of 3 main different types of participant you may, and I realize we're hugely generalizing and that's not what we do, but we're going to do 3 different types of participant, and I want you guys to guess what type of participant Katrina is going to be modeling, and I'm going to be
this is my BAFTA moment.
So we've done the setup with each of these participants. We're not doing the setup, but we do the same setup with those participants. So again, that kind of go through your checklist. And then what we're going to do is going to ask the question, and I'm going to put this in the chat now, which is a broad question. Let me send this with some probes in it. Okay. So should I spotlight this again?
I've done that already.
Have you?
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Maybe we have to. Maybe it's just right.
Oh, sorry, I pinned it for me. I didn't spotlight it for everyone. Sorry.
Okay, amateur. Right. So we're going to start, and we're just going to do 2 minutes of some probing. So we're going to start with that broad overarching question, and then use some probes to try and unpack what this particular participant is saying. And your job, guys, is to guess what kind of participant Katrina is modeling for us today. Katrina, be nice.
It's not one of the ones.
So thank you very much for giving your consent, Katrina. Am I right to start and get going with your first question?
Yeah, I suppose so.
Oh, fantastic. So my first question is, can you tell me about a time at work where you felt really proud?
Right. Does it have to be recent? It
can be recent, it can be within, so what's important is that you remember it in enough.
Okay. It's just my job's not very interesting, so I don't think much of what I've got to say is going to be very interesting for you. Does it matter what type of thing
No, it's
I
just
talk about?
what makes you feel, what is there anything that's made you feel proud recently?
Well, yes, I suppose so. I think I'm a dog walker, you see, and when I take difficult dogs,
Hmm.
I don't know, is this the right thing? Is this the
Yeah,
right sort of
absolutely. Yeah,
thing?
continue on. Yeah.
Okay. So when I take a difficult dog, and then they seem more happy, more sociable, then I feel very proud.
So tell me, let's zoom into that if that's all right.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
so when you say a difficult dog, what makes a dog difficult? I'm not really familiar with your
Okay.
world, if it were. So tell me a
Oh,
little
all
bit about
right.
what makes a dog difficult.
Okay. Yes, I can talk about that.
Hmm.
So if a dog has been perhaps as a rescue dog,
Hmm.
or has a challenging household,
Hmm.
then that might make a dog difficult if they are, they don't behave well on the lead or they haven't got good recall. Is this useful?
Yeah. How long have you been doing this?
All my life.
Really?
We stop now because I can't
Yeah,
keep the dog
absolutely.
walker
No,
protects
done
up
that.
anymore.
Yeah. Okay, so that's participant one.
Sorry, didn't
We're
mean to
now
do that.
we're now going to move on to participant two.
You can put in the chat what you think.
Hi, Katrina.
Hi, lovely to meet you. I've been so looking forward to today.
I can't wait to get started.
Oh
So,
yes, me too. I've put the dog outside. I've made myself a cup of coffee.
oh,
I've got
fantastic.
all ready. I've got some notes ready to go. So I think
Excellent.
it's going to be great.
Excellent. Right, are you ready? I'm going to start with the first
Oh yeah,
question.
I'm more than ready.
Okay.
I was born ready.
Excellent. So, can you tell me about a time at work where you felt really proud?
Oh well, there's so many. I don't really know where to start.
Well,
So if I
how about you pick one which is really significant to you?
Okay. Well, I mean, there's so many, but I'll start and I'll try and limit it to one if I can. But
That'd be
so
great.
I'm going back now, maybe 20 years, and I can talk through the whole history really of my career because there's been so
Just
many
something.
moments of which I've been
Sorry.
proud, and I think I'll just be able to tell you more meaningfully if I go back through my whole history and
Okay.
start really when I left school.
I'm just going to interrupt you there. What would be really great is if we could focus on something relatively recent
Oh,
where you can remember specific event or incident in quite a lot of depth. I'm going to be asking quite a lot of questions to really understand this
oh, I
particular experience
see.
in
I
detail.
see.
So
I
is there
see.
anything more recent that you can think of?
Yes, yes, certainly. Well, there was the incident that happened, a couple of months ago, and there was
Okay.
me and Sarah and Jess
Who's
and
Sarah?
Adam and Bill, and I think we were all there, but I can't really quite remember whether Sarah was there now I think about it.
Okay.
Shall I check with Jess to see if she knows Sarah
No,
with
that's
her?
absolutely fine. As long as you
Okay,
remember
okay.
broadly. So you sort of mentioned, not really too worried about that. So when did this take place, this event?
A couple of months ago, I think it was a
Okay.
Tuesday morning, and we were
What about this
into.
event was significant to you? What about made you feel really proud?
Oh, I see. Um, So this would help if Katrina had actually thought of an event that
Okay,
made
so
her
that's
feel
participant
proud.
two. That's participant two. So now we're moving on to final participant three. So you can see the change in technique that's having to be used with the different participants. So participant three. So are you ready to get started with the interview?
Just one second. Let me just put my phone on silent.
Oh yeah,
I'm expecting some very important messages. It's not going to take
yeah.
long, is it?
No, that's fine. No, no, not at all. Thank you again so much for taking the time to speak
Okay.
to me. I really do appreciate it.
Yes.
So
Um,
could you
sorry.
tell me, are you ready to get going? Is everything
Yes, I think so.
fantastic? Great. So I'm going to start with the first question, if that's all right.
Yes.
Great. So could you tell me about a time at work where you felt really proud?
Um, is that a relevant question to I thought I was going to talk about the systems project.
Yeah, absolutely. And this research project is about how individuals manage themselves through complex projects.
Oh,
So really the focus is on you, and what you did in that project, how you led that project, the kinds of experiences you felt during that time. So tell me a little bit about what made you feel proud about the systems project specifically.
well, obviously I'm very good at my job.
What makes you say that?
Well, I'm the senior director. Of course I'm good at my job.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Tell me a bit more about that. How did you end up in that role?
Um, well, I got promoted because of my excellent track record in managing change. You know, it's not very easy to manage change here, and I do it brilliantly.
So tell me a bit, when you say about it's not easy to manage change, tell me what about it is not easy when you use that word specifically?
Well, people are challenging. Often I have to work with people who aren't really up to their jobs, and it can be quite, you know, difficult to get them to cooperate.
Is there a specific example of that we could potentially talk about?
Well, yes, I suppose I've had to be working with the marketing department, and they're just all a bit wishy-washy in marketing, to be honest, between you and I. And it takes a lot of time I don't have to be able to get them on board with things. And then they're also young, they don't really understand, you know, the change and what's required of them. So I have to do a lot of work with them. I could probably stop that.
Okay, we'll stop that. So those are kind of examples of the three very different participants. Is there anything
most people got them? My acting is obviously tremendous.
Oscar winner. So is there anything that you kind of noticed about the different techniques that were being used there? Does, you know, and feel free also to chat and also to unmute yourself if you want to sort of jump in.
I think Alex has put a really good question in the chat, or comment in the chat, saying where arrogant Dave, Alex, was criticizing other people, and I think that is something that often happens in an interview and can be quite uncomfortable. People can see it as a safe space, and so there might be a bit of gossip and there might be a bit of slagging other people off, and it's important not to just to let that go. Really, you're not likely to need to pick them up on it. It does depend a little bit what they say, but you know, you just change the tack and get onto a different footing, really, if they're going to start, you know. So I was using deliberately ageist language, so you probably want to steer away from that really quickly. I've never had anyone use anything worse than that sort of language, and I think you do need to sort of steer them away and get them talking about something else quite quickly.
Alex, got your hand
Yeah, sorry to interject, just to
No,
I think, you know, I said sort of jokingly on the chat, some of them seem a little bit close to home for me. I think when some of us obviously in neurodivergence, and I think sometimes we come across like that, and when we don't mean to, you know, I don't know, not so much about sort of arrogant, but sort of maybe a bit distracted at times, a little bit talking about maybe slightly irrelevant things, you know, that sort of thing. So I guess it's not wanting to sort of invalidate that, you know. So but obviously you need to keep on track because, you know, you've got a job to do. So it's a balance, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Sorry.
I was going to say, you never invalidate what's been said, and you never heard me say, "Oh, I don't really want to hear that," or "That's not what I'm supposed to hear." You know, that's not your job. And also, sometimes those kind of throwaway comments that individuals make, you know, or I just need to, you know, and you know, often participants had a participant that used a fidget and different fidgets, and we had a conversation for about 50 minutes about this fidget, and it was actually really useful. So it's not about invalidating, it's about, and sometimes individuals need that space to just decompress or think about something, and, you know, away from the interview environment. So you have to manage that, and you should never ever invalidate anything that anyone says. That's not your job.
Yeah, I think it's happened where I've had somebody doing interviews in a context where they've heard one person say something and then someone is saying completely the opposite. Oh, this project was a great success, and then someone saying, oh my God, it was a nightmare. And of course, then they go, oh, well, what's the truth? Well, it doesn't matter. What you need to understand is, why did this person, why are they experiencing it as great, and why is this person experiencing? So you'd never go, well, Joe told me it was a complete, balls up from start to finish. How can you say it's great? So you're not ever trying to bring evidence in or judge what they're saying. But no, that's
and just kind of two final. So Leah, just to point out, we weren't doing the setup in that example.
Yeah,
we would have done the setup to begin with. What we really want to show was the use of probes. And I think Jennifer made a comment around, there's a lot of probes. Now, sometimes for some participants, in order to coach them through to get where you need to, you might have to use probes quite a lot to begin with. Whereas other participants, sometimes you just need to let them talk for 2 minutes and get some stuff off their chest. So it's just about managing that appropriately.
Right. So we are overrunning, Helen, despite our best efforts. So I think we are now at a stage where we are going to just pull the slides back up.
So we have a bit of time for you guys to have a practice. It's completely up to you guys. I'm aware that some of you may have other meetings and commitments, but we're going to stay around. So we've got sort of 15 minutes left for the practice session. So feel free to stay and have a practice if you wish to, but if not, this is a practice that you can use with other people. So you get into trios, you have an interviewer, an interviewee, and an interviewee, and an observer, and you basically practice the setup and just the beginning of an interview, just to get that sort of getting familiar with that and to get confident with that. So we're going to put you into breakout rooms again. I can't see if I've got any direct messages. Let's check.
So I think I'm going to create 4 breakout rooms.
Yeah.
That's all. Someone's just dropped out. Maybe we only need 3. I'll start with 4 breakout rooms, and then Helen and I will just pop into the breakout rooms and check whether that's okay with everybody. But it's just very, it's using the question that we've just practiced as well. So the numbers are going down. Maybe we'll only need 3. What do you think, Helen?
Maybe 3.
That includes us. All right. We'll give this a go and see how you feel about that.
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt to clarify now. How important is the answer to that question? Because when Helen took on participant 3, there were kind of 4 different tangents from the probes. And so by the time we got to the end, we were way away from that question.
I mean, obviously that was a rather artificial and manufactured just scenario. So if that was in a real interview, if that question was really important, you might want to make sure that you had made some notes about the different sort of leads that you got at the start, and then you do that circling back once somebody had gone through a discussion on the first part. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
And just to point, it's also not about getting an answer to a question. You're more interested, that question is framed so that if you're looking, it's that broad experience. So you might not end up with something that you think directly matches it, but it's, again, what's important to that participant. So you might need to give them a bit of space to kind of go all over the place, and it might take 10 minutes for them to finally get to a place where they're back in work and they've got an example that you can focus on.
Is that okay, Jen? I'm just going to open these rooms now, and then I think we've got 2 3s and a 2. So we'll just give you sort of 5 minutes to practice.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are they moving? Yes. It always takes a while. Yeah. Okay, so I think everyone's in breakout rooms. I'm going to stop recording.
Resilient.
Hopefully that just gave you a taste of of practicing. It's obviously not long enough, but
yeah. Well, hopefully you enjoyed it, and you know, any comments or, you know, in terms of how you found the technique, etc. I know it wasn't long, but feel free to take, you know, the materials we've sent and to use those and practice those. But just gives you an idea of that you can. I always have like an interviewer mode when I go into, but yeah, and interrupting, you will get more used to it. And it's probably one of the few places in life where you feel like you can do it legitimately without backlash. So just some kind of final thoughts, really, and we're interested to know you guys, you know, our own debrief. You know, please free to chuck some stuff into the chat as well, stuff you felt. But really, just some final thoughts to kind of go over. Katrina, it's pink, so she.
I thought you were going ahead with it, so I was quiet for change. It is just about practice, and hopefully, if nothing else today, perhaps you've made some contact with some people you can do some informal practice with. Because that is really helpful, and there isn't another way of doing it. I will still get quite anxious before I go and do an interview. I did one last week, but I hadn't done one the week before. I hadn't done one for a couple of months, and I always have to sort of run through my own mental checklist before I start if I haven't done one for a while. If you're doing a lot close together, it does get easier, but it is very tiring. And it's, you know, there isn't such a thing as a perfect interview, in the same way that there's no perfect research question or no perfect analysis. So don't beat yourselves up too hard if you make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. Did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would just say, you know, just from a couple of recent experiences, just reflecting what Alex pointed out earlier. So I found that I've had to be, particularly with some participants, I've had to be a lot more specific with my questioning, and sometimes the open, broad questions some people can struggle with because it's not specific enough. So sometimes you just need to manage that, and when a participant is struggling, you know, with a broad open question, you can and you should be and help them and be more specific. So if you're looking, you know, about being proud at work, and they say, well, I don't know really what you mean by proud, you say, you know, where you've achieved really great target, or you might have got promotion, you know, you can add some specifics to help them if you wish, and that's an important point to make.
I mean, interviewees get more skilled as the interview as it goes on too. So once, it's often that first bit that's the trickiest. You'll either get someone that, you know, you just have to let go blah, 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 for 5 minutes, or someone that needs a bit more probing. There often isn't much middle ground, really.
Yeah. And that's really it from us. Thanks very much for sticking with it.
I think we wanted to share, if anyone is able to share some of our details about our breaking binaries research, we would be very grateful. So either contact us via email, or you'll find that we've got lots of stuff, even on LinkedIn now, and on X and on Instagram. If you follow Breaking Binaries, it's the more snowballing you can help us with, to reference an earlier point, the better. And we will be posting the video and the with our acting talent premiering on YouTube. We do have a YouTube channel. It makes it sound terribly posh, but we only just post these recordings on there, and the slides and the handout. We will all put on the Breaking Binaries blog, which you can access via that little QR code on the screen, the pink one. Because our diaries are a little bit busy, usually I try and do it the same day. It's very possible I won't get to do it till the end of the week, so apologies for that, but it will get out this week. And thank you very much to everyone for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much for interacting and for taking part.
Lasting the entire session.
Yeah, and we hope you have a good week, everyone.
Yeah, thanks very much, everybody.